So there's several verses going on today that seem to be very controversial for people, and specifically the verse found in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12. That verse says, "But I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over man, but to remain quiet." This is what we would be calling a prescriptive verse, but a lot of people take this verse out of context and assume that what Paul is writing here to Timothy is only distinctly unique for the church in Ephesus and is only cultural and is not as transcultural, meaning it doesn't apply to us today. Well, that's just simply incorrect, and it's just a poor understanding of the context in which Paul is writing here. So when you are thinking about this verse, you have to look at within the immediate context of this verse in verse 12, but then the surrounding verses going before it and after it, but then also the context of the entire chapter. So if we actually break down the book of 1 Timothy, what happens throughout 1 Timothy is Paul is addressing at the beginning directly for false teachers, and then in chapter 4 he continues this thought, but then in chapter 2 he takes a shift. And in the shift he gives specific instructions for both men and women and leaders within the church. And in one of those sections, he gives instructions for men, but then he also addresses women specifically. Now, when you look at verse 12, you can't look at verse 12 in isolation. I have to also look at verses 9 and 13 to really understand the context. Because if you look at verse 9, he uses the term likewise, meaning as what he had just said with the men in verse 8, so for is the same way into application for the women. And then he goes into verse 10 and he starts to describe that this is not how women are to dress if these are women who are professing godliness. Don't dress in any kind of a way that would distract or deter anyone from worshiping and glorifying God by then taking and looking at the woman and saying, wow, look how incredible this woman is based off of her dress. See, that was a cultural issue at the time, but isn't that still applicable today? Can't women and men too still dress in a way that is detracting people from worshiping God by distracting them to worship the person? Now, then he goes into verse 11. And when he says in verse 11, we see a positive attribute here that women are allowed and commanded to learn. And see, this is revolutionary if you think about this in the context of when Paul is writing this. A lot of these believers at the church in Ephesus came out of Judaism, in which these women were not allowed to attend synagogues, nor were they allowed to learn. But Paul is saying the women must learn, but he is giving us a qualification for how they are to learn. He ends verse 11 with the word quietness, but then he also ends verse 12, the following verse, with quiet as well. So what Paul does here with the word quiet is he brackets what is being said here for the manner in which the women are supposed to be learning. They are allowed to learn, they should learn, they're commanded to learn, but he says that women are to learn in all quietness, and they are not allowed to exercise authority over the men. Well, why is it men only? Well, later on in 1 Timothy chapter 3, he gives us qualifications for the leaders of the church. And one of those qualifications within that is a husband of one wife or a one-woman man. So that can only be applicable for the men. So the leaders of the church are men. And then you might think, well, if that's the case, then there is no way that that could be applying to us today because it is still cultural. That's just Paul writing to the church in Ephesus. Well, if you jump down to verse 13, Paul appeals to the created order. And when you appeal to the created order, that's a universal truth. So if you look at Genesis chapter 2, we see that Adam was made first and then Eve was made second. Some people may argue, well, no. The submissiveness of the wife to the husband and the orders of the genders between male and female is a result of the fall. Incorrect. What Paul is saying here is that Adam was created first, then Eve. So Paul is referring to pre-fall, not post-fall. This is how God had created the two genders. Now, Paul also mentions in Galatians that there is no longer any distinctions between male, female, Jew, or Greek. So what Paul is saying is that spiritually, men and women are equals, but then their distinct roles and how they function are different. We are equal as unto salvation, but we are different as to our roles specifically, and specifically within the context of the church. This is a brief overview, but I want you to go read the rest of the blog as this makes a lot more sense in unpacking what is Paul saying here. So to answer the question, can women be pastors? According to Paul in 1 Timothy 2:12, no, they cannot. Now, there's other verses that people may try and pull out regarding Deborah, Priscilla, and Aquila and everything else. I can address that at a later date, but for now you need to understand that Paul's writing in 1 Timothy 2:12 was not merely cultural, but it's actually transcultural, meaning it is prescriptive for us today. Hopefully that helps you guys understand what Paul is saying here in this passage.